breath.
Well, welcome everyone, and good day, good middle of the day to you all. I hope you're having a good day, and thank you very much for joining us for this Women's Climate conversation online. I'm Janet Salisbury, and I'm the founder of the Women's Climate Congress. And I'd like to start, as we always do, by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded land of the First Nations people here in Australia. And I am actually at the moment, I'm away from my homeland, and I'm in Margaret River in Western Australia, which is Wadandi Boonja country, which means a meeting place of land and sea. And I'd like to pay my deep respects to all of the elders past, present, and emerging, and I deeply acknowledge their custodianship of the land over many millennia. And I invite you to put maybe in the chat a little introduction for yourself as you're joining, and maybe where you're coming from. And I just have to disable the waiting room so that everyone can come in. That's excellent. The Women's Climate Congress is an Australian not-for-profit organisation founded in January 2020, and we're working to promote non-partisan women's participation, leadership and priorities for action on climate change alongside deep listening and collaboration across different political, business and community perspectives. Since its formation, WCC has engaged with thousands of women from all parts of Australia and overseas across political parties and from all walks of life. And we're connected nationally and internationally to women at many levels of governance and decision-making. And today we're bringing our special Women's Climate Congress focus to talk about gender equality, climate change and disaster risk management. And I want to make a big welcome to all of those who are joining us from overseas today. We have people registered from Africa, India, Bangladesh, Europe, America, North and South, and the Pacific, as well as from all over Australia. So I'm not sure how many of you are all here today, but welcome to you all. And just thinking about that connection of women from all around the world, maybe just take a moment to feel how we are joining hands through this virtual space around to bring our perspective to this big, difficult issue of climate change. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Toni Hassan, who is a member of the core Women's Climate Congress organisational group. And she is going to lead our conversation today with our three wonderful guests who she will introduce. Toni has a background in communications, community development and public policy. She's a writer and award-winning journalist and has many years of experience working with the Australian Broadcasting Company before taking on various other roles as policy advisor to government and in non-government organisations. Most recently, the Equality Rights Alliance, which is the biggest of the Australian government-funded women's organisational alliances and represents, I think, over 60 women's organisations. Toni's also a visual artist and brings a unique artistic voice to public discourse around challenging democratic issues, including climate change. So over to you, Toni.
Thanks so much, Janet, and welcome. It's a pleasure to join you all around the world. Mary Picard is with us. Mary is a gender and disaster risk reduction expert and consultant. She's also on the Women's Climate Congress Steering Circle. Professor Margaret Alston, AM, is the head of Gender Leadership and Social Sustainability, the research unit there at Newcastle University. And also joining us from the middle of Australia, roughly, is Amanda Lamont, co-founder of the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. And it's wonderful to be part of this circle with you to help facilitate what is a vast topic. So I'm hoping today that we can, regardless of our experience where we are in the world on this topic, there'll be some insight and most of all, some tangible takeaways around gender, climate change and disaster risk reduction. But I want to start with Mary Picard first. You've been raising, Mary, the profile of the gender dimensions of disasters on the international stage to better manage disaster risks for some time. But you've got an interesting story as to how you got there. Can you tell us how you first got involved?
Thanks, Toni. Yes, and welcome everybody. Great to see you all here. Yes, actually, I call this my accidental career because I was living in Guatemala and my husband was working there with the United Nations system, and a major disaster happened there. So it's a country that has volcanoes and it has earthquakes, but this time it had massive flooding caused by 2 weeks of non-stop tropical rain. And so that resulted in many of the poor people living up the sides of mountains having their homes slide away, their farms slide away, and in fact an entire village of 500 people was covered by a massive landslide. That was the first exposure I had to that kind of scale of disaster. I wasn't personally a responder. That was in 2005. I didn't have the knowledge or skills to help, and I didn't have enough Spanish. But the following year, I was contacted by someone from Geneva Red Cross because we had lived in Geneva and I got to know people there, asking if I could do a review in Guatemala of the law and policy situation when the international assistance came into Guatemala for that disaster, that Hurricane Stan, which became Tropical Storm Stan in 2005. So in 2006 was when I really started doing this work by someone who knew someone who knew someone, because they needed a person there to do the review. So I didn't really know anything about humanitarian response or anything before that. So I had to learn a lot in a very short time, and looked at the policy and systems that were in place for bringing in international response in developing countries where they had disasters that exceeded their national capacity. So that was how I started, and that was in 2006.
And what struck you about that particular disaster as you grappled with researching it for the Red Cross?
Yeah, well, I must say that the Red Cross at that point in that study didn't particularly have a gender lens on
It's
this
the Women's Climate Coalition.
analysing the response.
I might ask people who are online, thanks for joining us. If you could mute yourself, then we're better able to focus on the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Toni. But it definitely did have a poverty lens, and you could see the intersection between the history of development in a country that was very divided in income between 50% Indigenous people who were nearly all really poor, and the settler communities that had been there for a long time, and who owned most of the good land. And so the Indigenous people had been pushed further and further up the mountains onto the most precarious land, and so they were the ones who definitely had the greatest impact from the landslides. So you could see where development and lack of prevention had contributed to the disaster. Also, it was like systems that were set up for different sorts of disasters, and so they weren't really geared up for responding to massive floods, because that was an unusual pattern, possibly, I now see, possibly related to climate change. And so I then also learned that there was this whole international system of providing humanitarian response, and that there were a range of different actors in that, both governments and civil society, and that they weren't always doing the best thing they could. I mean, they were always well-intentioned, but sometimes there was a lack of coordination with the countries where the event was happening. And so there's a lot of issues of coordination. So yeah, it's opened up a whole world for me, a new understanding of the links between development and disasters, and the way disasters are fundamentally preventable when you define them in terms of the impact of hazards on people.
Well, that's very useful. One, to frame this in terms of the multiple actors at work and the important role coordinators play, or who takes responsibility for coordination, let alone what the actors do or don't do, and patterns, and noticing that climate obviously is having an impact. And that helps set the scene in terms of, you know, we all are aware of another record hot year around the globe, and now 28 COPs Conference of the Parties that came out of the UN framework to tackle climate change. So what matters is not what countries promise, but what they're actually doing. And sadly, climate change is now a reality, creating a pattern of disaster, right? So because of that reality, we can also expect more disasters. But as you say, there's plenty to prevent. So that takes us to your role, Mary, in the building of frameworks to help us prevent the worst of it, but also manage the risks. Now, there are a number of global frameworks to manage risks, and one of them is called the Sendai Framework. And from it is a new disaster risk reduction gender action plan. Now, you were part of its development. How do you think this particular plan helps us?
Okay, so this is a plan that adds on to an existing international agreement called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction that was agreed in 2015. 2015 was a really big year for international agreements. As most of you will remember, the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, then the Sustainable Development Goals, and also this agreement on disaster risk reduction. So there was a lot of energy taken from the women's organisations in that year on the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. There was less energy left over for looking at disaster risk reduction, which I think at that time was really not seen as integral. And I think really an understanding has developed that there are really strong links between disaster risk reduction and climate change. And I think even more recently, the link between those and gender. And so there wasn't really enough guidance, specific guidance in the Sendai plan, the Sendai Framework, to give us a really good handle on what needed to be done in terms of gender and disaster risk reduction. So this process for establishing a Sendai Gender Action Plan began really sort of 2 years ago. It was finally consulted during last year and launched early this year. And what that does, the idea is to really frame some key objectives, key priorities, and a number of model actions, recommended actions that can be taken at country level. So it's not a theoretical plan, it's a very practical plan, and it's designed for both civil society and governments working at national and regional level to say, okay, you know, we've been asking how to do this, and now you're giving us a lot of guidance on how to do it. And so we can integrate this into our national plans, and we can integrate it into our policies. So we can do that in Australia, and we can do it in a number of other countries as well.
Okay, so you say it's not prescriptive, it's a guide, it's for governments and all civil societies to integrate key ideas into national policies and their implementation. How would you say, given, I guess, the late start, we can say there are green shoots. The good news is there is convergence across the three things: climate change, disaster risk management, and gender. But how are we doing? I mean, Australia's had enough experience, surely, of disasters, whether they're floods and bushfires, and we'll go to Margaret soon on the question of the living experience of the flood disaster in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. But how is Australia tracking? Who's doing well here? Who are the bright spots?
Well, that's a difficult question because it's very mixed, as you know, with our state and federal system, and we have each state has primary responsibility for emergency response, and Amanda can go into this more later, I'm sure. And so the federal action on integrate emergency response is really sort of fairly new in the sense of the establishment of the National Emergency Management Agency only 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago. But I think there is still a big focus on emergency response and not enough on prevention. And also, I think we don't, I'm trying to think of the bright spots, but we have good work happening in the gender policy area, and we have good work happening in disaster risk reduction, but we don't yet see those coming together at a policy level.
Okay, great.
So that's a good place to go to.
Okay, indeed. Thank you for the segue. So if I can bring you in here, Margaret Alston, as a social worker trained academic, you followed the flood disaster that hit the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, interviewing women, many social workers, about the gendered impacts of that regional event and its impacts, especially on residents' health and well-being. Tell us what you found.
Yes, so we were looking at the gendered impacts specifically, and I'll segue from this discussion of the Northern Rivers to other research that I've done
Sure.
across Asia and the Pacific. But what we found in the Northern Rivers was quite significant issues around women's safety, and that became very evident in reports from the shelters, for example, where people were fleeing for safety, and there were some issues in those shelters that were not conducive to women's health.
So the evacuation centres were established, presumably at the local level by local governments.
They were, and that was done, you know, like people were giving these particular space, the services and so forth. But there was not necessarily any focus on safety. People were given beds and so forth, and food, and but we came away thinking that there needs to be shelters need to be, you know, there needs to be spaces for women and children. Just as an example, there might be people on AVOs who were in the same room, as it were, as the people who were victims of, and that was still in the court system, but here it was in full view in, you know, in the shelters. So
wow. So Margaret, you've been around, and yet this surprised you, didn't it? The lack of.
I don't know why I felt
vision.
some sort of cultural superiority or whatever it was, and it really made me come up short.
Right. So
I
you
had
were
to
genuinely
really examine myself, because
right.
we had found the same issues in Bangladesh, for example, where shelters were set up. Women were very unsafe, as it turned out, and women stopped going to the shelters because it was just simply too unsafe. So when I discovered the same issue in Australia, I felt some sort of sense of horror at my own naivety, I guess, to be, yeah. So that was.
So the risks were not managed, and obviously that's a lesson going forward. You'd expect what, security officers or police?
Well, the police were coming around during the day, but they left about 3 o'clock every day or something. There was, I don't quote me on that, but they were leaving for significant periods. And so, look, I'm sure that if they had the time over again, that wouldn't happen. But we have to be prepared for gendered issues. We know about them. We know that they're going to occur, and we need to be prepared. It needs to be built into our management plans, because the safety of women and children has been compromised in every disaster that we've studied, and I think we need to really understand that.
Marita, hello, you're online with us, and we're hearing a bit of background noise there, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, sorry.
Your mic.
Sorry, I thought I was muting. Sorry.
No.
I am listening, but I'm working.
That's fine. So Margaret has pointed to a pattern, and the surprise that in Australia, even though it's been raised in many contexts and globally, the issue of safety was clear as a problem in Lismore, because there is plenty of research to point to increases in family violence or violence, sexual violence, during and after disaster contexts, would you say, Margaret? And
when we did work in the after the Black Saturday fires, again, and we did that a couple of years after the disaster, to go back into the communities and see how they were recovering. And what we discovered was that the number of relationship breakdowns following in the years following the disaster were quite high. So there was an impact on relationships. We did dig down around, you know, what might have been the cause of that, but you know, I have only anecdotal evidence that people were saying that it was because of decisions taken on the day that tended where men wanted to stay and fight the fires and women needed to get away with the children and left it a little late. So, you know, that it's that sort of tension on the day that seemed to have infiltrated relationships.
Well, looking to be
but
solutions
also-
focused, Margaret, pointing to the vulnerabilities of families and couples during and post a disaster. You're pointing to perhaps the need for a plan around it, so it reduces.
Well, we
friction
just
and
need
disagreement?
to make gender transparent. You know, it just needs to be part of the plan in you know, in any plans that are developed. We need to be very clear about safety, and we need to be very clear about who's where in shelters and so forth. And I think we need to have a gender expert on any management committee that develops, you know, that is put together during and after a disaster. It just needs to be there critically front and centre.
I would like Amanda to talk to that, but I'll come to you in a moment, Amanda. Just with you for another question, Margaret, is the point about, I guess, gender stereotypes. You've pointed to what men may do and what women may do. I mean, everyone suffers, let's say, and remind ourselves that all genders and sex suffer during disasters, but men are expected to act like heroes, do step up for those physical jobs, right? And women tend to, as your studies have revealed, step up and do organic care work beyond their own families. They carry that load. So what would you like us to know about the sorts of roles, the hypermasculine emergency services piece, but also what women tend to do, and again, that planning piece, so that we're aware, and who takes responsibility for that awareness piece?
Yeah. Well, there's some big ideas you've just thrown out there. One of the issues I'll just pick up on was, you know, what they do after the disaster. The hypermasculinity issue is something that is revealed in all studies of disasters, and it would be very churlish for us to condemn that, because that, you know, that response to disaster, the immediate mobilisation that goes on, we need to really honour that. The other thing I'd like to say, though, is in every disaster that I've looked at, women's response tends to be, you know, you see the community organisations and a lot of women coming together to build a safe space, you know, to provide clothing, to provide food, to really nurture the community. What we found in Lismore were the establishment of what we called hubs, where, you know, voluntary women were setting up these safe spaces where, you know, people could just come and sit and maybe have a cup of coffee. They didn't have to talk to anyone, and it was just that space that was very valued by people in the community. Now, we do find that this efforts of women to establish these safe spaces is so well documented that we know it's going to happen, but they're not funded, and we're arguing that these sorts of initiatives need to be funded. It tends to be the case that after, you know, a certain period of time, women will burn out because they're doing all of this without being able to address other issues in their lives effectively. So
thank you for pointing that out. And I guess for our international audience, you may be aware that we've had a federal budget delivered just last night here in Australia. And look, there wasn't very much for welfare, let alone work that honours the voluntary commitment of women, or perhaps something like funding women-led hubs. So, I mean, I've written a great deal about this in my former role with the Equality Rights Alliance, which is we have a welfare system that's punitive, that says go and find work and be under mutual obligation rules to do that work, rather than acknowledge the work that women already do on the ground and to support them to do that. And that is care work often, and that certainly is care work during and in the wake of disasters. And there is this sort of need, I think, to have that conversation about how we do welfare, and how we, in the light of climate events, support communities to genuinely recover. So thank you. Look, there's a lot to unpack there, and we will in questions as well. But to Amanda Lamont, if I can, you're a firefighter in Victoria and a volunteer with the Red Cross. When and how did the penny drop for you about the need for the movement you've helped establish, the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network? What was the catalyst there?
I guess there's the spiritual catalyst, which I would say has been growing inside me since the day I was born. But then there was the literal penny dropping catalyst, and it was actually 6 years ago here in Melbourne. A group of us women who worked in very different roles in the emergency sector came together for a United Nations Women's Breakfast to celebrate International Women's Day. And the topic of discussion at that breakfast was disasters and humanitarian aid and support globally. And as we looked around the table at each other, we realised that each of us had very different roles in emergencies, and that there wasn't a network for women who work in the emergency and disaster sector. And Bridget Tian, one of the other co-founders, started up alongside of me and said, Amanda, I think we need to build a network here for us to come together more regularly. And I just immediately said, this is a great idea. Let's have a coffee next week. And one of my Red Cross volunteers, Kath Cooney, joined us for coffee. And the three of us decided that this was something that we would like to pursue. And we wrote to 200 of our closest friends around Australia and said, we had this idea, what do you think? And we were inundated with support. Shit, yeah, was one of the comments that was made from somebody I value and admire very much in Sydney. And everyone said, yes, why isn't there one? It's amazing that there isn't one. And suddenly the penny did drop because we realised there was a need and there was a desire and a lot of encouragement from leading practitioners and women around the country. And if I mention who the network is for, we're not talking about firefighters and people on the front line in uniforms. We recognise that women play a lot of different roles in the emergency and disaster sector. And you've talked about policy and strategy and legislation. So women who work in local, state and Commonwealth government have important roles to play, leading and guiding strategy and policy. We have female firefighters and females in SES and other emergency services, ambulance and police. And really importantly, as Margaret suggested, we see women in a front line in a very different but really critical and important way. And they are the women who are embedded within community, who don't wear a uniform, but rally immediately in response to a disaster and provide critical care and support. And you mentioned the word volunteers. Interestingly, they would not see themselves as volunteers. They would see themselves as humans. They would see themselves as women, and they would see themselves as community members doing what they knew was right and what they were driven to do. So they would not define themselves as volunteers. So we developed a network to bring together all of the different women who play all of those different roles before, during, and after disasters, so we could connect, be together, support each other. We wanted recognition of all the roles that we do, and often those hidden roles that are life-saving roles in themselves. And we wanted to promote and support women to rise through leadership so we can have equality around the decision-making tables.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think Margaret's pointed to it, but women do step up organically. They may not call themselves volunteers, but in Lismore, they helped hold that community together. And I'm wondering if it translates into more formal leadership roles beyond the informal leadership roles. What do you observe about that?
Oh, well, here, I'll go off script. We don't have a script, so it's not off script. I wonder why we need to call it leadership. I like the word leadership rather than leader. I think everybody is a leader and everyone has a role to demonstrate leadership. And I sometimes worry that if we formalize these roles, they disappear. What I've seen in emergencies that I've actually been impacted by as well as respond to is that we had this organic stepping up across all genders and all people want to come and help. That's what people naturally do. They want to help other people. They don't run away from danger, they run towards it. It's not just men and it's not just uniforms. we do that. So women come together, they set up these hubs, these groups, these places for people to be, to eat, to charge their phone, to have a shower and just connect, to have a safe place. What I've seen happen is that after a couple of days, when the local government, state government, emergency service organisations mobilise and rally and get to the place, maybe they were cut off, is that a lot of those women step back because they see the uniform, they see the role, they see the responsibility, and they think, oh, somebody else is here now, they know better, we'll step back and let them take over. What I've done is I encourage them to keep going because they really know best. They really need to lead, but not be given a formal role, but not assume they need a formal role in order to continue to show those leadership qualities. So we want to make sure that women are represented and having a role to play in decision-making. But in order to formalise the leadership, I think that sometimes takes away a little bit of the magic. So I think we should support them, but not necessarily give them a badge and a uniform.
Yeah, and it's more than semantics, the word leader, leadership. It's a big conversation. What do we mean? But I guess we are interested in systems change. And there is a lot of work happening in this area, and there's increasingly a lot of money thrown at it too. So a national emergency management agency, huge public service around that. In Australia, $1 billion disaster ready fund, blah, blah, blah. But given all of that, is it still largely men who continue to decide how a community mitigates, how a community officially responds? And, you know, that's kind of, I guess, the piece that the Women's Climate Congress is interested in, as you know, being a member. You know, how do we say all in, bring all that you are, all of your lived experience, all of those micro skills, all of your passion, and honour that? Are we seeing a shift?
Well, thank you for asking. This is really interesting. What we have seen is generally a lot of the response roles are performed by men, and a lot of the work in recovery and preparedness, those roles are performed by women. So when we say there's an overrepresentation of men in emergencies, we really are talking about light sirens, uniforms, response, but we see the opposite. For example, in the Red Cross, most of my colleagues in the emergency services are women, and we have less men supporting in the softer skills in the recovery phase. When we see a national appointment of somebody in a recovery phase to a declared emergency, I'm often surprised. I'm always surprised when it's a man that steps into that role. So what I'm seeing is women do these roles day to day in the recovery phase of a disaster. They're working, they're planning, they're meeting, they're connecting, they're building preparedness skills to be better ready for the recovery. And then when an appointment is made for the national recovery or the state recovery or the disaster recovery person to lead this recovery, we've seen men step into those roles. They are men that have potentially had an emergency services background or a military background or a policing background. And I am surprised that with all of the women and all their experience, both professional and lived experience, and all of the years that they've committed to supporting communities in preparedness and recovery, that a decision is made to appoint somebody who may not necessarily have all of those skills in the moment because it's seen for some reason that person seemed to be the best choice. I would like to explore that further. I'm not suggesting that any of those men that have been appointed to those roles don't have the skills. I know them and I've worked alongside some of them, and they are great humans. But I think we're missing something when we continue to put men in the roles that are traditionally held by women at all levels. But that top job, when it comes, they seem to be going to men. I want to know why. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer for you.
Yeah.
And I, again, need to emphasize and respect. I know some of these men, they are fabulous humans. But I would love to see some women in those roles.
Well, asking the question is as powerful as getting the answer. So we put it out there and maybe we'll get a response in the chat. Before I go back to Mary, you've talked about your international experience joining firefighting efforts abroad and have been struck by what Canada is doing to better prepare communities. And I'd love you to talk to that.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Oh, no, I don't know. I don't know too much about what.
Oh, you mentioned the disaster pack.
Yeah.
And in terms of that really basic preparing work that needs to happen family to family, village to village, there's something there. And and if that's not a question you really want to go to, I mean, there's also the work.
That might have been something that I mentioned to you.
Oh, okay, sure. But also the,
Mm.
and I'll open it up then, the sort of, I guess we've been skirting around sort of identity as women. When joining the emergency sector, say, what pressures are you under to behave like men? And this, you know, this piece about how we change culture, and it's starting with saying, no, I'm going to be in my own lane and I'm going to be what I do best. Want to speak to that, Mary, quickly?
Oh, I wanted to talk to that one. Go, Mary.
No.
Oh, sorry, Amanda.
Yeah. Amanda.
Oh, look, I just want to talk about firefighting and the changes that I've seen on a really positive and hopeful note, because when I've been firefighting as a volunteer in Victoria for about 12 years, and it was interesting. I went down to the fire station for a briefing for the bushfire season with my ex-partner, and he's a very tall, 6'3", solid Frenchman. And after the session, some of the firefighters came up and looked at him and said, "Oh, you might like to consider joining." And then they looked at me as an afterthought and said, "Oh, you could too." And I was really shocked. My dad's a bush firefighter ranger, and I never actually thought of that as something that I might not do. And in fact, I am the firefighter and my ex is not. And I was surprised at the stereotype 12 years ago. And when I arrived at the fire station, there were a few women, there were mainly men. And I had a sense that the women there were trying to fit in. They were trying to be like the other men and blend in and not stand out as a woman, because that would be seen as weak and different and othering. So what I was seeing was women who were fitting in by being like men. And over the course of time, and as I arrived and I started talking about gendered language and equal opportunity and climate and resilience and community engagement, I ruffled feathers. I think the women were wishing that I would be quiet because I was standing out as a woman and potentially outing them, and they would be all tainted with the annoying feminist in the room that I was apparently being labelled as. But what I've seen a shift in time is this fabulous embracing of femininity in firefighting and other emergency services. We are happy to wear makeup, do our hair, have nail polish, present on the fireground, at training, at events as women, not trying to look like men, but actually being wonderfully comfortable as women with all our femininity in whatever that is. And I actually think that that's embraced and supported. And I actually am a volunteer in a wonderful fire brigade with strong diversity. We have some ways to go, but I love the fact that I have seen the transition in my brigade from trying to look like a man to fit in, to embracing all of our femininity in whatever way we want to.
Oh, that's a wonderful, wonderful story. Thank you. Yeah, so back to you, Margaret, on this question of perhaps the global experience and sort of lessons learned around preparedness and disaster packs, perhaps developed in Canada or elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it was me who mentioned to you the disaster packs that were becoming a feature in Canada, because they do have a lot of wildfires in Canada. And the disaster packs in fact become commercialized, where they're sold to people. They've got pockets for all of your different papers, you know, your insurance documents, your birth certificates. One of the big things after a disaster, if your house is burnt down, you've lost everything, but you've also lost your identity. And that's a really critical thing. So, I mean, it might seem like a small thing, but in Canada, it's taken off. And that is just to encourage people to have a disaster pack. The Red Cross in Australia also fosters disaster packs, and they suggest things like even including a favourite child toy in the disaster pack, and just little things that can make different family members feel a little bit more comfortable. But the big thing is the documents, so that you can prove who you are.
I wonder the addition of, you know, just a template that says, this is what I will do, and this is what he will do, and this is what the kids might do, to avoid that kind of anxiety about who's not doing what or where people are and so on. Do you think, is that a useful addition? Is that in the mix?
Yes, it is. So having a rendezvous point is something that is encouraged. So, you know, in the event of a disaster, this is where various family members will meet. So that's something that can be put into the disaster pack. You know, so just to have that place, because chances are not every family member will be at home at the time. So they do take it seriously. As I said, their wildfires have been extraordinary. And
yes, but the adaptation piece around understanding that we might revert to rigid stereotypes, not to diss what men may do stepping up in physical work, but at times of high stress, anticipating it and planning somewhat. You also mentioned, Margaret, the well, it's come up twice now, the burnout, inevitable burnout, and especially for women, given the emotional load they'll carry in traditional or other care roles. So what's your advice around that? How do we mitigate that? And I'm opening it up at this point.
The big thing that we find is that I think Amanda's sort of referred to this, how women want to nurture and build collaboration, but it's being able to shut off. So in fact, you know, women will still be there at 10 o'clock at night, and then they'll arrive again at 7 a.m. trying to help their community. And that's real burnout territory. And you do find that unless, you know, that it's a big issue for women who are assisting in fires. Just one thing I'd like to sort of add too is that identity thing. And what we found in the Black Saturday fires was that it was really difficult for people to you know, have themselves recognised. And so in the Lismore floods, we found that government had made it a little easier, that you just needed to ring up the support for the funding that was available and identify yourself and your address. Now, the issue that followed that when we were in Lismore was that people from outside the community were ringing up to the helpline and saying, I'm so-and-so, I live at this address, and getting the funding. And like there was one house that 26 people had claimed. So I'm just mentioning that to let you know that there are insidious things that can happen following disaster that really do impact on people who have been through the disaster. So I just found that just an issue that really grates really strongly with me.
Thank you. Well, where there are vulnerabilities, there will be exploitation. And fraud is a known outcome in the wake of disasters. And I guess it's up to governments to do the necessary work to avoid that or prevent it. Mary, is there something you want to say in response to what you've heard in light of your international experience?
Yeah, I think what's very interesting is that I had some revelations like you, Margaret, about thinking that Australia did things right and other countries didn't necessarily. So especially in relation to disaster risk reduction and things like building on floodplains, that I used to say to people overseas, oh, we have local governments that don't allow that to happen. But then I realised that in fact we had local governments that did allow that to happen. So thinking about the risk reduction aspect of it, I think, is really important. So we need to think about where people are, because that's a part of the risk, but we also need to plan for the way that the emergencies impact differently on people, and particularly women, where especially women in lower socioeconomic groups who don't have that access to immediate finance to get themselves back on their feet and end up being a long time out of work, and they get what the experts call labour market scarring. So they end up sort of being put back for the rest of their lives. and in Australia, we don't have so much of the issue of girls missing out on school, but in other countries, poorer countries, that's a very common thing, that girls miss out on school for a long time after disasters. That happened during COVID, which is also a form of disaster. So I think we need to think about risks in a very global sense in terms of climate-related disaster hazards, but also the development impacts of slower impacts. Not always things that are a big disaster that happens on one day and then you mop up. So there's a lot of things related to drought. We have that in Australia as well, but we have pretty good drought assistance. In many other countries, particularly in Africa, they don't have that same assistance. So thinking ahead, pre-positioning supplies, changing the way, if you have good seasonal forecasts, changing the way you're planting and things like that, and grazing. So they're really important. But really, really key in all that is also recognising that the different work roles of women and men and the prejudice and discrimination against women and people of diverse genders really have an impact on how they recover. So it's not necessarily that more women die, or although in some circumstances they do, depending on where they are and what the levels of inequality are. But it's about thinking about how the response takes into account the gender differences in the way work is conducted in the society and the empowerment of individuals and their different economic starting points. So that's a really important part for me now that I really focus on, is the prevention aspect. So I know that all the emergency response needs to happen, but the prevention aspect and the reconstruction and recovery, that you've then got to build in the prevention for the next time.
Of course.
No, can I just add a point there? I'm so glad you brought in gender experiences elsewhere. And the one that I was hoping to raise is child marriage that occurs in disaster zones across Asia and Africa. And that is one of the ways that families adjust, is to sell a girl child into marriage. And that is quite common unless there is funding available to the families, which countries are trying to address. But it's an issue that we as women should be aware of, that the child marriage in across Asian countries in the wake of a disaster is something we should acknowledge and risk and be aware of.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. Thank you, Margaret. I have served on the board of Be Slavery Free, and so I'm very conscious of the trafficking and implications for children especially. Yes, of course, if economic security is threatened or worsens, all sorts of new frailties emerge and children are especially at risk. I'm conscious of the time at 1:20 as we record this on the Australian Eastern Seaboard. And so with 5 to 10 minutes for conversations, and with thanks to what you've gifted us with already to get us going and more, I want to give it back to, or hand back to Janet for what's in the chat and maybe where we go from here.
Oh, thanks, Toni, and thank you very much to everyone for that wonderful conversation. So in the chat, we've got a lot of shout outs, wonderful shout outs to other work that is being done in this area. And I'm sure that people have been able to follow that. And there's also quite a number of comments about other work. I'll just mention a couple. Winnie mentions the Gen West report. This is from Marramanong in Melbourne, sorry. Our Community, Our Voice. It's a local response to disaster. And Karen Andrews similarly mentions Women's Health Loddon in the Mallee and the women's experience of the 2022 floods. And there are some other examples. And I think it's Cass Ray, who is joining us from Tasmania, also talks about the advantages of a small state in networking and having a sense of agency. And I suppose those other local responses are other examples of that. So I suppose there's a question there about the significance of, or what can be achieved on a small scale versus the bigger picture of the national response. So maybe that's something we can...
Yeah, well, thank you, because on my list of questions was that broad tease around what we can do on the ground as individuals to ensure we are engaged, either with local government or not, municipalities, to be better prepared. What role can each of us play? Is there something tangible we can take away today besides what you've offered, Mary, Amanda, and Margaret?
I'm happy to jump in first, if you like. Every single role is the role that we should play, every single one that's important to us. And I'll take a step back and go a little bit higher up and philosophical for a moment. A lot of our disaster risk reduction and planning concentrates on risk. And we first understand risk. And I have been advocating for a couple of years now that we're forgetting the other first step, which is what we value. We can't understand what the risks are until we understand what we value. And I think each and every one of us should take stock and take a moment to look at our lives, where we live, the things around us, the natural places, the people around us, our homes, and understand what we really value about those, and actually to remember how valuable it is to us. And then we need to understand our risk context. What are the risks to those things that we value? And we're talking about disasters, we're talking about climate, but there's lots of other things that can impact things that we value. So for us to fully appreciate and understand the risks to those things, and then to start thinking about what control and power that we have ourselves to manage those risks in a different way, not to outsource that for somebody else to think about, not to outsource it to a man in uniform, not to outsource that to government departments, but actually our National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, which is now 13 years old, and I'm going to suggest that's because there's no strong need to change it because there's so much good stuff in it. The underwriting principle is shared responsibility. And I know people got sick of that comment during COVID, but let's just think about, we all have a role to play, and we all have a responsibility and an agency to protect the things that we value. So one of the things that I do before bushfire season where I live, I wander around my house and I choose the things that I don't want to lose and that I really value, and I take them off the mountain and I put them in a locker. It costs $40 a month. And I know that I'm going to have those things in the new life that I will lead if I lose everything else. And what I've seen sitting alongside people on the worst day of their life is that they feel like that life never happened. So if you've got things that you value that can bring with you from that old life before the disaster into the new life after the disaster, that can be a game changer because it validates your existence before. The before is important. You don't want to lose it. So my advice is really think about what you value, the people you value, the things you value, the clean air, the green spaces,
The photos.
what the risks are, and take steps yourself, and then work with your community and your neighbours. You do this at an individual level first, then your house, then your community, then your business, then a broader sense. And if you work in these roles, think about it from your organisational perspective and think about how you can start advocating for a more shared responsibility so people have agency in their own destiny.
Thank you. Well, it reminds me of what I have written about, the so-called mud armies that Margaret will be aware of in the Northern Rivers that were activated to clean up after those floods. And stories emerged of women in their homes being told to get out of the way as the men came through, and threw basically all of their home contents on the footpath. And they were doing an amazing job, hurried work, efficient work, but their methods were seen as insensitive and certainly not trauma-informed. But if there had been some planning around the things I treasure, the things they treasure, it may have looked different. Well, I'm conscious of the time. Is there one other comment around that before we wind up with Janet, Margaret or Mary?
There's so many issues that we can cover, but
Yes.
it's been wonderful to hear from Amanda and Mary about these different approaches to disaster. But essentially, my key message is gender is a really significant issue in disasters, in pre-disasters, in post-disasters, and we need to ensure that that's recognised.
Yeah. Thank you, Margaret. I have to agree, and I really think that we're making quite a lot of progress in Australia and in many other countries and in the international awareness about the the gender dimension to disasters for both prevention and recovery. So I think that I feel very optimistic, and I hope that the Sendai Gender Action Plan will actually be used in Australia as well, because there is a lot that's relevant there, and that will be used in other countries to help support that awareness and that work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And certainly in the internet age, we're not short of resources and capacity, hopefully, to find out more and go where our passions and energies take us to be better equipped for inevitable disasters and that arc of disaster risk management, because this is everything from risk reduction and hazard adaptation to response and recovery, the whole cycle, and in fact, the whole of life. So thanks to you all. I'm going to hand it back to Janet with the formal ending, and go well.
Well, thank you very much to Toni, and also to Mary, Margaret and Amanda for that wonderful conversation. I think everyone can join me in a sort of a Zoom cheers, and thank you very much to our guests. And some takeaway issues I'm taking away that it's a complex issue. There's multiple actors involved in this disaster response, and hang on, I'm just gonna spotlight. And also there's a major convergence between disaster risk, climate change and gender. And this isn't totally well acknowledged or very well integrated at the moment into all of our different planning systems. But there is wonderful work going out there that we need to sort of amplify and keep talking up and getting into the mainstream. And I suppose in relation to the WCC, the issue of gender is really a key focus here. Yesterday I was speaking in another event where I was talking about the issue of gender equality in relation to decision making about climate change mitigation, and how there's a blind spot in the climate movement about the real significance and the nexus between gender equality and emissions reduction, say. And here we're also hearing in relation to disaster risk that there's this very, very important nexus as well. So take that away and talk to whoever you're having conversations with about these things. And please, if you're not a member of the Women's Climate Congress, you can go to our website, which is on that screen behind me, womensclimatecongress.com, where we have a join button for you to join the organisation, and then you'll get information about the next of these events which we run quite regularly. So thank you very much again to everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in Australia or indeed around the world, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.